In the winter of 2016, I conducted an interview with a high school senior.
First, since you are a minor still, um, you get to make up your own pseudonym.
Oh,
What do you
great.
want your name to be?
Um, I'll go with Max
All right,
because Mad Max Fury Road is a fantastic picture.
Cool.
Max and I discussed his use of technology, and in particular, what he thought about social media. The conversation started in a way that was pretty declarative and straightforward.
I think the biggest thing that older generations should really understand about technology is it's just a way. It's almost a catalyst to make doing old things easier.
And eventually, things became more reflective, touching on topics from gamification to social currency. Max was witty and deeply insightful about himself and his peers, and sometimes he was so incisive that it was downright funny.
When I joined Facebook fairly recently, only 2 months ago. And I remember the first thing I did was I looked up my friends from my old school who I haven't talked to in the better part of 11 years. Well, we all have phones. I could have talked to them in the better part of 11 years, but I didn't because I didn't want to. Oh, but now I'm on Facebook and I need to friend everybody. So because, God forbid I don't get to wake up and know what my old friend Dylan ate for breakfast this morning. That's really going to ruin my day.
In one of his closing remarks in the interview, he compared social media use to addiction, and I asked him to elaborate.
Addiction sounds like a really unhealthy word to use. Does social media feel like an unhealthy influence in your life?
Not in my life personally, but I do think if used, I do think it potentially could be.
Max's opinions were colored by a uniquely charismatic wit and flair, but this invocation of the word addiction by the end of the interview made me wonder if other teenagers would agree. It's one thing to hear adults, who may not have an emic understanding of teenagers' digital lives, call their habits and behaviors addictive, but it felt like another thing entirely to hear it from a teenager directly. And so I interviewed more high school students to dig deeper. What would other kids think of Max's insights? Would they agree? Would they think Max was just sensationalizing behaviors that they thought were normal? I knew there was something happening here, and I had to find out. I ended up interviewing 8 more high school students. A boy and a girl, each from 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. All of the interviews followed the same semi-structured format. We sat down one-on-one and listened to the interview that Max and I did. Instead of preparing interview questions myself, I explained that we would sit and listen together and use Max's words as a starting point for our own conversations. Sometimes I would pause Max's recording and ask if the student agreed or disagreed, and other times the students would pause the recording themselves to chime in with their own opinions. This format was an effective entry point to a series of great conversations with all 8 of these other teenagers, and their perspectives came across honestly and thoughtfully. But there were some caveats about this format too. First of all, listening to the interview with Max essentially created a slew of leading questions. Max's charismatic, insightful approach pointed students to confront some challenging ideas, which was the goal of my interviews, but I'm sure it also affected the responses that I received. Second, I only recruited students from the school where I teach. The fact that I already had a relationship with these young people made it easier for them to talk to me, but I'm sure I would have received different responses if I had talked to a different group of kids. And third, well, I'm still a teacher, so I approached these interviews as teachable moments by allowing each teenager to reflect on his or her own behaviors. I didn't just want raw data. But in the end, bias was not a deciding concern of this research because objectivity was never really the goal. I collected over 6.5 hours of interviews with these 9 students in the hopes of catching a glimpse of their lived experiences and trying to make sense of it all. The goal here was portraiture. In contrast to other qualitative approaches Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot and Jessica Hoffman Davis describe, which seek to establish validity, portraiture's standard is authenticity. So let's continue to paint a fuller portrait of teenagers' use of social media by hearing what their voices authentically have to say.
Facebook,
Instagram, Snapchat.
Reddit.
So, it doesn't take a whole lot of research to know that teenagers use a lot of social media.
Go from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to Snapchat to Vine to Facebook, and then just circle back through for hours and hours and hours.
But what isn't often captured is how they feel about their social media use. That's where things started to get a whole lot more interesting.
I feel like technology has this like leash to us. It's like the feeling of guilt. Like you feel guilty about something that's always there. It's in the back of your mind, no matter how much you want to, push it away.
This 12th grade student used some striking language to describe her relationship to technology, as if technology has a leash on us, or that it follows us around like guilt. Another 12th grade student tried to put the impact of heavy social media use into context.
It's destructive, not in the same way that alcoholism is or heroin addiction is, but it's still having a profound impact on us.
The comparison here is alarming too. Well, maybe the easiest way for us as adults to respond to this is just to blame the kids. If they don't like using social media so much, maybe they just shouldn't use it. By now they should have learned that if you eat too much candy, eventually you'll get sick. But their messages made me think that maybe it's not that simple.
I need it. It's like my mom can't have a day without coffee. She gets a headache. She, can't function. I think I couldn't function without a phone in my hand, as scary as that sounds.
Hearing these messages and the apparent helplessness in that tone of voice made me pause. There are issues of power and control at play here, and the kids I talked to did not come off as empowered masters of technology. Arjun Apatturai's book, Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, introduced the idea of cultural flows, these specific irregularities in the way that mass media pervades communities around the world, blurring the geographical boundaries that used to contain different cultures. His concept of cultural flows explain how Kobe Bryant is a phenomenon in China, and how Japanese manga is a hit in some places here in the US. The way we consume and transmit media flows all around the world, ignoring national boundaries. Part of the engine that keeps this flow moving along is a chain that Apatturai describes between consumption, pleasure, and agency. Where there is consumption, there is pleasure, and where there is pleasure, there is agency, he says. But in 1996, Apatturai was writing about mass media, like music, television, and movies. The World Wide Web was only 2 years old at that time. Now, in the era of social media, platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter make me wonder if consumption, agency, and pleasure are still directly linked. Do these kids actually have agency over their social media usage? Are they drawing pleasure out of their social media consumption?
It's just such a part of technology, I can't avoid it at this point.
The trick of social media is to make us think that it's a minor part of our lives while being a huge part of our lives.
It's just integrated into everything.
Many of the teenagers I spoke to didn't have a hand on the dial to control how and when they use social media. Many struggled even to articulate what value they get from social media.
What social media does is it creates this weird desire, at least amongst, my generation, to always be in the know, whether it's worth your time or not.
Young people are experiencing this. They don't really understand it, and in fact, they think it's a little scary.
And that's why it's kind of like a sickness, I think. Because we do it for so long, but we don't know why. It just kind of happens. And that's kind of scary, I think.
These voices are urging us, as adults, to look more closely at this with a critical lens. These teenagers almost seem victimized, even oppressed by their compulsive use of something that they don't entirely understand. They are investing a precious resource, their time, into social media without questioning it at all. They deserve to ask questions, and we ought to help them examine who is building social media platforms and for what purpose, and what role these teenagers are playing in the social media landscape, and if they want those roles at all. In helping teenagers explore these questions, we then need to turn that critical lens on ourselves, too. Whether or not we are building these platforms, benefiting from them, or even using them, we need to ask if we are complicit in the culture that is doing this to kids. Are we perpetuating a world in which this addictive or compulsive behavior is so normalized that kids don't even know that it's their choice to opt in or opt out? That they deserve to talk about this and make decisions for themselves?
I've never even got the chance to like express my feelings about social media. Nobody asks you, do you like social media? You just do it, you know? Or like, nobody asks you about this kind of stuff, which is weird because everybody does it. It's like, why isn't it more of a discussion?
Why can't we talk about it? Is digital literacy like sex education? Something that schools are trying to figure out how to teach, but it's too taboo or too littered with cultural landmines for us to help young people learn and make responsible decisions for themselves. Teaching digital literacy means helping students understand the answers to these questions. It means giving them agency in how, when, and why they participate, and giving them the power not to participate when that's what's best. Perhaps a patternized chain from consumption to pleasure to agency is the way it should be, but not necessarily the way it is. The good news here is that many of these young people are ready to learn. They are experiencing something, but they don't have the means to understand it yet.
But I'd say that's something that I really want to know more about, is how companies are so good at keeping my brain inside their system.
If there's something to be optimistic about, it's that they want to know. They want to be empowered. And more good news is that we, the adults, do have the tools to understand it. Dana Boyd's analysis of online social networks as networked publics, and in particular how these spaces suffer from collapsed social contexts, can help us understand recent trends of users, especially teenagers, moving from broadcasting tools like Facebook and Twitter to narrowcasting tools like Facebook Messenger and Snapchat. Jose Van Dyck has analyzed how the evolving interface of Facebook over the last decade has mirrored that company's evolving ideology about online identities. And then we can take these same analytical strategies to understand how other websites like LinkedIn express their priorities and their values through the interface on their websites. We can help students learn that each of these platforms are designed environments and that they have been made for particular purposes. And then we can find ways to leverage these lessons into new, compelling ways to help kids learn more generally. Mimi Ito's research on connected learning points us to new directions that can help us empower young people as they learn and as they make sense of their world.
I haven't told anyone about how I spend this time before. It's like a wake-up call. That sounds very cheesy. It's definitely a wake-up call. I don't know if I'm able to do anything about it, but it would be nice to try.
So let's open our hearts and shut down our iPhones, because the kids want to try, and so we ought to help them try.